Welcome to Truths, the podcast where love for Torah, Israel, the Jewish people, and God meets fearless critical inquiry. Through powerful conversations and thought-provoking solo teachings, we explore how timeless Jewish wisdom can ignite 21st century meaning, drive personal transformation, deepen our connection to God and to one another, and inspire bold action to heal our world. Here's your host, Rabbi Dr. Levi Brackman.
Welcome back to Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today. Thank you so much for joining. Before I begin, if you like this episode, please subscribe, like it, leave a review wherever you listen to this podcast. That really helps other people find it, and I would also greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much. Now, on to today's episode. Today is going to be a solo episode, and it's a follow-on of a previous episode I did, which was an interview with Rabbi Manis Friedman. Now, Rabbi Manis Friedman, we had a conversation, it was for an hour, and he said at the end of it to be continued. And there were things which were incomplete, let's say, with the episode, and therefore I wanted to continue that conversation with him. I did reach out to him and to his people, and I didn't hear back. So I'm assuming that it's therefore probably not going to be continued with Rabbi Friedman in person, but I do feel that it's an important conversation to continue having. And therefore I would like to do another episode on this, even if it's just me explaining or tying up loose ends as I see it. I first want to mention that I think that in the conversation with Rabbi Manis Friedman, a lot of his ideas are pointing to some of the deepest ideas found in Hasidic thought. But my concern with the way he frames it is that if you teach these ideas as a shortcut, you end up flattening the whole ladder and you lose the context. And in losing the context, you lose a lot of the other pieces as well. And I want to give an example of a story that happened when I was a teenager that might shed some light on this. So this probably happened in the summer of 1996 or 1997, one of those years. This was close to 30 years ago. So I was 17 or 18 years old. And I was in summer camp in Gan Israel, New York, which was upstate New York. And every single year they have a gathering there where great Talmidei Chachamim, Rashi Yeshivas, and Torah scholars get together for the weekend. And they spend the weekend together and they do a lot of Torah studies and classes, etc., etc. And I was very interested in listening to as many of these classes as I could, but I was a counselor of a bunk that I needed to take care of. So I went to one of my friends there, who today is a big rabbi in a certain country. I won't mention who he is, but I went over to one of my friends who was a learning teacher and therefore didn't have the same kind of responsibilities that I had. And I asked him whether he would be so kind and watch my bunk for a few hours while I went on the Shabbat to listen to the Torah classes. So I needed some cover. So this fellow looked at me and said to me, "What do you mean? Why do you want to go on the Torah classes? You've got work to do here as a counselor of these kids and to have an impact and to have an influence of these kids. And that's the most important thing." And then he said to me, "Have you heard of the Hasidim Harishonim, the early Hasidim?" Which that he meant the Hasidim Ashkenaz. I think that's what he meant. And I said to him, yes, of course, I'd heard of them. And he said, "Well, you sound like the Misnagdim Harishonim, like the very early Misnagdim," he said. Like students of the Gaon of Vilna and others who opposed Hasidism at the time. He said, "You sound like them. You don't sound like a Hasid, in other words. And you certainly don't sound of a current Hasid, a Hasid of the Rebbe." And I was a Lubavitcher Bacher at the time in the Lubavitcher camp, of course. So he said, "You don't sound like a Hasid of the Rebbe." So I said to him, "I don't know what you mean, because the truth is that I am a student. I'm a Bacher in yeshiva, and my main goal is to learn as much Torah as I can. Unfortunately, the yeshiva is closed for the summer, and I needed a job. I needed a place to stay. So I found a job as a counselor, but I didn't really want to be a counselor. That's not what I really wanted to do. I want to sit and learn." As a matter of fact, when I was in camp, every moment I had, I would run off and go to the base manager, sit and learn, because that's what interested me back then. And frankly, it's still what interests me till this current day. And now I have an opportunity, I said, to go and listen to the teachings and the classes of some world-renowned Torah scholars, of course I'm going to want to do that. And I said to him, not only that, I'm sure that's what the Rebbe would want from me. And he looked at me and said to me, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. And I said to him, what do you mean I'm wrong? He said, ask any of the mashpiyim. In other words, ask any of the Hasidic teachers who were here, world-renowned Hasidic teachers who were here, ask them if I'm right. I'm telling you, they're going to tell you that I'm right. So I was thinking about this the whole weekend. On Sunday morning, I found my opportunity. I saw Rabbi Yoel Kahn, who was the Rebbe's chayzer. He was the person who used to memorize the head chayzer. He was the main person who used to memorize all the Rebbe's talks and then repeat them and then write them down and edit them, etc. And I saw him sitting there. He used to smoke at the time, so he was sitting there on his own, smoking a cigarette. And I walked over to him and I said to him, do you mind if I ask you a question? He said, sure. So I sat down and I relayed to him the conversation I had had with my friend. And I said to him, who's right, me or him? And I thought I would get a quick answer. And he looked at me and he said, you were right. So validation, straight away, yes, I was right. And then he followed on by saying, however, he said in Yiddish, der was will nicht gehen auf Schlips von Rebben, und dort liegt die Hund begraben. Which means in English, he who doesn't want to go on the Rebbe's shlippus, being an emissary of the Rebbe, that's where the dog's buried. And I, at the time, was not interested in going on shlippus. That wasn't my thing. I did want to learn a lot, but I wasn't interested in being an emissary, going and opening a Chabad house or any of those things, which anyone who knows me later on, I actually end up doing that. And maybe we'll talk about that a little bit, but I no longer do that, just to be clear. But then he went on for an hour and a half. He sat there for an hour and a half explaining how the whole point of everything, all of the entire Chabad Chassidus leads up to this one thing, which is going on the shlichus of the Rebbe and going out there, opening a Chabad house, putting on tefillin with people, etc., etc. And anyone who knows Rabbi Yoel Kahn, and I became a student of his subsequently to that, and I went to a lot of his shurim, and I even sat in his house Friday nights, etc. Anyone who knows him, he has this ability to explain something from all angles. He doesn't just give an answer. He goes and explains from every single different angle, and at the end of it, he ties it all up together in this beautiful way where you fully understand where he's coming from, what he has said. So I had an hour and a half personal share from Rabbi Yoel Kahn about this. And it really changed my life, and it set me on the path to want to go on shlichus, which is something that I eventually did. But what I think that shows is this sharp dichotomy. So Rabbi Yoel Kahn, he started off by telling me, you're right. My friend was wrong, and I was right. However, that's not the whole picture. There's more to the picture here. And at the end of it, there's a goal. In other words, there is a telos. There is a mountaintop here. And the mountaintop is, in his view at the time, was going on the Rebbe shlippus. But he didn't say that I was wrong for wanting to go as a bacher to listen to this shurim. He said, you're right, you should want to. That should be your goal as a bacher right now, to go and listen to shurim. You're right, Torasi and Manasi. My profession at that time was to learn Torah. That's what my whole thing was. And that's what I should want to do whenever I had an opportunity to do it. However, he said, there's something else there, which is the telos, which is the ultimate goal. And so there is an entire picture here, which I feel is missing from the discourse that I had with Rabbi Manis Friedman and the way Rabbi Manis Friedman portrays these ideas. And so this isn't a criticism of him, but I think that the way he presents things in general, it's incomplete. Now, he has this desire to say things in a way which is somewhat shocking. When you say that the whole yeshiva world doesn't have a God, which is something he said to me, then that is a shocking way of saying something. He could say it in a way in which maybe people would accept it a little bit better. So he has this way about him, which he says things in a way in which are shocking, and therefore it loses some of the nuance. So what I hope to do in this episode, for those who are going to be with me, is to go through some of that nuance, and hopefully we can come out of this with a more complete picture. Because as I said in the beginning, he is alluding to some very, very profound and deep ideas which are found in Hasidic thought, not just in the Hasidic thought of the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, but also the Hasidic thought which is found all the way to the first and second generation of Chabad, And specifically, these ideas are found and fleshed out in the teachings of Rabbi Manis Friedman, who was a Talmud Muvak, the main Talmud of, not the son, who was the middle Rebbe, but the main Talmud for many, many years, for 30 years, of the Alter Rebbe of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. So I want to, and these ideas, some of them which Manis Friedman talks about, are found in the teachings of Rabbi Manis Friedman specifically. So I want to go through it, and hopefully we can, piece by piece, go through some of the ideas which were discussed. This might be a little bit of a longer episode, but I hope that it will be payoff in the end. So I just want to make it clear here first that I am critiquing framings. I'm not attacking Rabbi Friedman as a person, God forbid. Now, a little bit about that, because in my conversation with him, some of the pushback or feedback I got from some people, especially those people who consider themselves to be students of Rabbi Manis Friedman, was that I was interrupting him a lot. And in fact, I was. And that was, I wanted to get through quite a bit. I know the way he speaks in a certain way. A lot of his ideas are out there already, so I wanted to cut to the chase in many ways so that we could get to some conclusion of what he's actually saying and what he's not saying. And therefore, that was by design. It wasn't meant to be any disrespect to him. And so we'll just put that out there. There are three pillars that emerged from my conversation with Rabbi Manis Friedman. First of all, the focus on what's revealed knowable. He had this line where he said, I believe that we know everything there is to know about God. Torah, mitzvahs, the will of God, the universe, that's all that God has let us to know about God, and we know everything there is to know about God. Anything else is not knowable, therefore we shouldn't talk about that, we shouldn't go there, and it's not even in existence. So what's the point of talking about it? It's not knowable, and you have a goal that you need to know God, and therefore you need to know what's knowable. If it's not knowable, then what's the point of even talking about it? It's not in existence, so there's no point talking about it. That was his point of view. The second point which he made was a skepticism toward mystical nothingness. And he basically said that any kind of feeling of spirituality is self-indulgent. It's the kind of meditation which gets you to a sense of transcendence is very similar in his view to Buddhism. And he said that feeling which you have is spiritual, not godly. It's not God, it's only spiritual. So ruchnius, not elikus. And then the other thing which he mentioned, which I think was a theme at the end, was where he criticized the yeshiva for making mitzvahs their God, but not the knowledge of God. They turned the whole ritual into the idol. And it's totally a godless pursuit of just doing ritual without it connecting to God, because God is transcendent, and you don't know him and you can't know him. So therefore you don't know God, is his argument, I think. And therefore you're doing the mitzvahs for what reason? Just for no reason. And therefore that was his point of view. And therefore it's you turning the mitzvahs into idols, and you don't, and the whole yeshiva world and the whole frum world doesn't have a God. So I want to take these ideas piece by piece. What it seems to me is that the idea which is being presented is that since we can't know the transcendent God, we can't know anything about him, therefore, we should just focus on that which is revealed, as I mentioned, which is the mitzvahs and the world around us and the Torah. And that is the manifestation of God in this world, and that's what we should focus on. The problem with this is that you end up with the point of view that this friend of mine in camp had. And so let me explain to you why that's a problem. Because this concept is actually a very deep idea, which is found in Hasidic thought. And that is that ultimately, as I mentioned in that episode, that there's a a-cosmism that is found in Hasidic thought. What is a-cosmism? A-cosmism is this idea that there is no cosmos. The entire cosmos is just the divine. It's just the divine essence. All that actually exists is only the divine essence. That is what's called Daas Elyon, the view from above, God's view. In God's view, none of this is here. None of it exists. It's only from our view that we think it exists. But from God's view, it doesn't exist. How can they both be at the same time? Well, that's the paradox. But there is this Daas Elyon that none of it exists. A cosmism of Hasidic thought is that from the vantage point of the divine essence, there is only the divine essence and nothing else. There can't be anything separate from the divine essence. So what are we? We're totally subsumed in the one, to the degree that we don't exist at all. Now, just getting to that on its own, that concept, and getting your head around that concept and feeling that sense of transcendence, which is something which I was talking about quite a bit in the episode and trying to get Manis Friedman to relate to, is a very deep concept. And I think what he misses is, that is the idea. That is the point he's actually trying to get at too. Let me try and get this from a different angle. And that is that there is Daas Tachton, as I mentioned, and there's Daas Elyon. So what is Daas Tachton? He articulated in our conversation a good Daas Tachton perspective. Daas Tachton is our ability to access the divine or spirituality. Well, what is that? That is this idea that the entire universe depends on God's energy, on the light of the divine. Without the light of the divine, there is no universe. So in other words, if we don't have God's energy, what happens to the universe? It ceases to exist. And therefore, the whole universe is totally dependent upon God, and without God, there is no universe. So therefore, we can get to some kind of apprehension and understanding that God is everything for the universe. That's what's known as Daas Tachton. And it's an idea which is used to even convince our animal soul, what's called the Nefesh Bahamis, that it should also recognize that the physicality is not so important. That's the idea of Daas Tachton. Now, living that and being able to truly feel that and apprehend it, that the world is totally dependent on the divine and therefore there has no independent existence without the divine, is itself a very lofty place to live. It in itself is living within a sense of transcendence, because that helps you transcend the physical. But it's not the ultimate, because there's Daas Elyon. What does Daas Elyon say? Daas Elyon says that even that which is the divine light, which keeps the world in existence, is in itself totally subsumed in the divine essence. And therefore, of course, the entire universe is subsumed in the divine essence. There is no universe at all. Not that it's totally dependent. It's not a contingent thing, that the universe is contingent on the divine. That would be the Daas Tachton perspective, the lower perspective, which is a contingent perspective, that the world is contingent on the divine. The Daas Elyon perspective, the perspective from God, is that there is no universe. It's the total a-cosmism. It's called panentheism, that the world is totally and utterly subsumed in the essence of God to the extent that it's not there. There is no universe. From God's essence, it's all one. From God's perspective and the essence of the divine, it's all one. Now, how does this lead to this idea that Manis Friedman is getting to? Well, it leads to it because at the end of the day, if it's all God's essence, then in some sense, the physical is a reflection of God's essence. That's how you get there. Now, that doesn't mean the world is God, because the world isn't God, because in the end of the day, there is no world from the Daas Elyon perspective. But we are walking around living in a world. That's true. So what is it? It's a reflection of the divine essence. It's a very, very deep idea. Now, you layer in that concept, the mitzvahs, that the whole point of this, which has been revealed to us through the Torah, is in order for us to study Torah and do mitzvahs. So then that becomes a more revealed sense of the divine essence. In other words, it's something which we can grab onto more of being a part of the divine essence. So in a strange sense, my argument to him about the a-cosmism and asking whether he's denying the a-cosmism of Chassidus, the answer really should be, you're not denying the a-cosmism of Chassidus. It's because of the a-cosmism of Chassidus that you have this concept. Because you say to yourself, 1 second, fact is that I'm here, I'm talking into this camera. I am having this conversation in the physical world, in the meter scale. But on the other hand, from the divine essence, from the perspective of the divine essence, you have a cosmic perspective. There is no cosmos. So what am I doing here? Somehow I'm in the divine essence in some kind of way. But that is a very, very profound realization. And it's a profound realization which only happens after you've gone through the ladder of the Daas Tachton first. So this is where I feel he's confusing and mixing the boundaries and the concepts. Because in the conversation, he talks about the Daas Tachton. He says, well, everything's God. He spoke about the contingency on God. But the contingency on God does not lead to the Daas Elyon perspective, which tells you that everything's in the divine essence and everything is mushrosh in atzmos, everything is sourced in atzmos. Very interesting, because this idea is actually part of a disagreement between Rabbi Manis Friedman, who was, as I mentioned, who was a Talmud Muvik of the Alter Rebbe, and the Mitzvah Rebbe. So just this is as an aside, just to get to this. So the Talmud Muvik of the Alter Rebbe, or Rabbi Shir Samadiadi, Rabbi Aaron Halevi Horowitz, known as Rabbi Manis Friedman, he basically had this idea that people should get excited about the divine, should have what's called hispailos, should have this excitement or this ecstasy about the divine, even if it's somewhat contrived. Whereas the Mitzvah Rebbe, Dov Ber, was very concerned about contrived ecstasy. He didn't like contrived ecstasy. What was the argument of Rabbi Aaron? Rabbi Aaron made the following argument. He said, one second, the shorish of everything, the source of everything is in atzmos, is in the divine essence anyway. So even the contrived aspect of the ecstasy is still in the divine essence. Because its source is in the divine essence, therefore, even if it seems somewhat contrived, it doesn't matter, because the person is feeling this arousal of excitement for the divine, for God, that is real in the realest sense, because all of physicality is really God. And therefore, in the truest sense, it's real. That's part of his argument. Now, the Mitzvah Rebbe, Dov Ber, doesn't buy that. So it's interesting how we go full circle, right? So the Lubavitch version of Chabad, as it was expressed by the Mitzvah Rebbe, he doesn't have, his acosmism is not on the same level, is not in the same way. It's a little bit, I would say, it's not the fully puritanistic acosmism that is found in Rabbi Aaron. And that's probably a little bit more of the reason why he is a little bit more apprehensive of any of this contrived ecstasy, whereas Rabbi Aaron is very okay with the contrived ecstasy. And one of the reasons he gives is the one I just mentioned, because it's all in the divine essence anyway, all source in the divine essence. But that in itself comes from a very, very deep and profound realization. And it starts off with the Daas Tachton. In other words, you have to go from level to level. As is explained, that, you first start off with the Avos, the patriarchs, who they were a Merkava, they were a chariot to the divine. That is a type of realization of the divine that they've come to. And then you transcend that. You go higher to the high level until you get to Moses. Moses, who had the most profound apprehension of the divine, and he had this bitul, total not the bitul. He was the a-cosmism of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses, who saw God, but he was able to see God in the clearest sense, although he never actually was able to apprehend the actual essence of the divine. But he was able to apprehend this idea that there is nothing, this universe that seems to us around us is totally subsumed in the one. And from that idea is where the idea that mitzvahs are important. It comes from that. So the reason why I say that it's incomplete is because you need that transcendence in order to have an apprehension of this idea. Now, I want to mention some other thing, which is really important, because there is this very, very important concept which is found in Hasidic teachings, and it comes from the Kabbalah, which it says, and it's also found in the Tanya, from Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the first Chabad Hasidic leader, the founder of the Chabad Hasidic thought. And it says that mitzvahs without the which means mitzvahs without love and fear, without experiencing the love and fear for the divine, they don't fly above. What does this mean, they don't fly above? So if you look at some of the teachings of the Maggid of Mezrich, he has this very, very mind-blowing teaching in which he says that the people who do mitzvahs anashim b'lumada, which means the people who just do mitzvahs, even if they're sitting all day in their talis and tefillin in the shul, but they're doing mitzvahs just out of rote, they're just doing the commandments out of rote, they're in a sense worse than Rishonim, worse than wicked people. Why? because he says that the wicked people, they might one day repent, and then they'll actually do the mitzvahs properly with the actual Islavus, with the Dveikus, with the sense of cleaving to the divine, with the sense of love and fear and awe, and they'll do it properly. Whereas the person who's doing mitzvahs and nashim ilamada, the person who's just doing mitzvahs because out of rote, he thinks he's doing it the right way. Therefore, he has no hope. Therefore, he's worse than a Rasha. There's this idea, which is found in early Hasidic masters, that just doing mitzvahs for the sake of mitzvahs, without the avira, without going up this ladder, without this sense of transcendence, is deeply, deeply problematic. Going back to my friend who told me that the most important thing I can do is be in doing the bunk and not going to listen to the shir from one of the great Torah scholars. He missed the point. He didn't understand that maybe ultimately, when you get to the highest level, you can apprehend how the physical is the greatest manifestation of the divine that could ever possibly be. That could be that you'll get there one day through working through the levels of the ladders, first Daas Tachton and then Daas Elyon, and really apprehending that until you have a really clear apprehension of that. So you're really able to do it. And then when you do mitzvahs, you're doing mitzvahs on the highest level possible with the greatest Islavos. Otherwise, if you say the mitzvahs are just everything we know about God, and you leave the transcendent out of it, you say, oh, that we shouldn't live that feels self-indulgent. That feels like Buddhism. We don't do that. All we do is actual mitzvahs. And we know God through the mitzvahs. The mitzvahs become mitzvahs anashim b'lamada. They become by rote. You're doing them, yes, because you feel they're connected in the divine, but it's a reductionism of God into the mitzvahs, into these physical acts, without the full apprehension, which has to happen through inner work, where you get to this sense of absolute transcendence, and then the realization that the most profound levels actually must be through the physical. Because in reality, the physical shouldn't be there. We shouldn't be here. The fact that it's here tells us something. Now, what's really interesting is Rabbi Aaron has this thing where he says that, yes, you get to this realization, but then if you try and search for it in the divine, you will never find it. So that this paradox, when this is the other concept, which I think that, with all due respect to Rabbi Manis Friedman, he doesn't like the concept of the paradox. So what is the paradox here? The paradox is, on the one hand, the a-cosmism of Chassidus tells us that none of this is here. We're not here. It's all God. It's also achieved in the one. And when you're Dorish, when you seek it, you try and understand, you realize it's not here. We're not here. On the other hand, we're here. How can that be? How can we, in essence, be not here and here at the same time? That's the paradox. That's the Pella. That's the paradox, what he calls the Pella, the paradox. So we have this paradox which exists, and through that paradox, that's where you can get this apprehension that something about the physical, and therefore by extension, doing the actual physical mitzvahs, has something very, very profound within it. It is a very profound idea, but it can't be taken in a vacuum. If it's taken in a vacuum, then what it sounds like is that you're reducing God to the mitzvah. No, we're not reducing God to the mitzvah. Make it very clear that this idea is not reducing God to the mitzvah, which sounds like what he's doing in a sense. Oh, God, the only thing we can know about God is he wants to do this mitzvah. No, God is so unbelievably incomprehensible, and it's such a level of nothingness, and it subsumes everything, and there can be no need in God. He says need doesn't really mean need, but there can be no need in God. There can be separation in God. There can be no chalkut. There can be that. Not God. God doesn't have parts. It's total not unity. Therefore, from that level, from that divine perspective of God, we don't exist. The universe doesn't exist. It's totally a-cosmism. But the fact is that we're here. That's the profound reality. We're here. We're in the divine. But if you take away the a-cosmism, then you're just left with us being here. And that's a problem. Then that's where you end up going back to my friend. He didn't understand, as Rabbi Yoel Kahn said, that I was right. I also didn't see the whole picture. I didn't see this part, which we're mentioning now. Now, whether that means that one should go on shlichus or not, that's something I don't necessarily see eye to eye on anymore. But this concept I was missing as well, that there's a Daas Elyon perspective here. We're all subsumed in the one. And by we're all subsumed in the one, yet we're still here. Somehow we must be mushush and atzmos. We must be somehow, we're in the one. That's how we subsumed it. What does that mean? The religious Jewish person will tell you it means that you need to do mitzvahs. Mitzvahs have a profound impact. But it comes from this profound realization of the a-cosmism of the Daas Elyon, which is found in Hasidic Chabad, especially as it's found in the first two generations. Okay, so I just wanted to talk about that. And then I wanted to mention something else, which he mentioned at the end, which is, I think, very, very important. Because when I was talking about this idea of sense of real transcendence and feeling being subsumed in the one, he said that that's not godliness, that is spirituality. And then he said that sounds very self-indulgent. Now, I think this is also another issue here, which we need to unpack a little bit. Because within Chabad Hasidic thought, which is, I'm talking about it on his turf, because he's an exponent. He expounds Chabad Hasidic thought. There is this idea that the soul of Jews, I happen to like what Rabbi Dr. said, that whenever it says in Chassidut, it says a Jew, it means a human, and when it says a tzaddik, it means a Jew. So therefore you can say the soul of people, human souls, are one with the divine. They're mamish. So our souls are a part of the divine, mamish, part of atzmos. It's found other places that the soul comes from atzmos. And because it comes from atzmos, it comes from God, it is a part of God, it constantly wants to go up, The problem is that we as humans, we're in the physical world, and we have what is known in Hasidic parlance as an nefesh bahamis, a animal soul. Most of the time we're in touch, when we live, we're in touch with the animal soul. And as we're in touch with the animal soul, we don't want to go up. So what we can do is we can start to meditate. When we meditate and we realize that actually the world is contingent, the animal soul also realizes the world is contingent and therefore gets on board with things. And then when he gets on board with things, then the nefesh elokis, the godly soul, is able to take over and it wants to soar above. Kol sanafshi. It has this desire, this thirsting to go above and to go back to its source, to the divine, to God itself. When you're feeling that ecstasy that one feels, it's not self-indulgence. That ecstasy is the sense, sweetness of God. You're in touch with God because you're now in touch with your divine. Your animal soul is gotten out of the way. It's convinced. It's gotten out of the way, at least for that time period. That's the idea of a Beinoni. The Beinoni is davening. When the Beinoni is davening, at that moment, the nefesh bahamis is convinced, it's on board. So now you can feel the experience of the loftiness of the transcendence of the divine. That is godly. That is God. That isn't spiritual. That's God. Why? Because now you're in touch with your God soul, which is a part of God himself. This is a fundamental concept within Chabad Hasidism, within Tanya. And it's a big mistake to say that somebody who's feeling divine ecstasy, someone who's feeling a sense of divinity, of transcendence, and has a sense of the immanence of the divine. I think these two come together, and I think I wasn't clear about it in the episode, that basically when you feel the transcendence, when you feel you're totally subsumed, that's when you feel closest to God. Your soul is able to soar above. The physical becomes much less important because that which makes the physical important, which is an nefesh bahamis, the animal soul, is on board. It also realizes it's less important, so it feels less important because you're in touch with your godly soul, and that is God. That's not self-indulgent. That's the opposite of self-indulgent. Self-indulgence is when you're indulging in what your nefesh bahamis wants, what your animal soul wants. That's self-indulgence. When you're indulging what your godly soul wants, that's godliness. That's not self-indulgence. So I just want to clear that up. That's really, 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 really important. Now, there's another concept here, which I want to talk about, which is, he said also, that sounds like Buddhism. Now, I said that I don't know a lot about Buddhism, but it turns out I know a little bit about Buddhism. My quip to him, or my response to him at the time, was that there's something which all mystics from all the different traditions have in common. And that is, they recognize that there's more to the universe than just the physical. Now, you might say, well, the physical is a manifestation of the divine essence as we described. Yeah, but that's not the physical as of us indulging the physical. That's just recognizing that the physical has to be totally subsumed, but we're still here. Therefore, we're also subsumed as the physical, as I mentioned. So the Buddhists also get this. So there's some overlap in that Venn diagram. Yes. So to say that there is aspects of this level of transcendence, of hisponenus, of meditative contemplation, or just the contemplative work of which is found in Chabad Chassidut, there is some overlap in the Venn diagram in Buddhism. Absolutely, certainly, without a doubt. But that doesn't matter. The fact that there's overlap doesn't mean anything. In other words, when you say, oh, that's Buddhism, that doesn't mean it's bad. You know, they say that if you're going along the right path, you'll meet others along the way. There's something which people in the East also figured out. Not only us who figured it out, other people also figured this out. Other mystics. So you meet other people along the way. So when someone says, oh, well, that's Buddhism, that doesn't mean it's wrong. Doesn't mean it's bad. Buddhism also has something right. But the idea here is that if you're able to, as I mentioned, you're able to transcend the Nefesh HaBahamis and get to your Nefesh HaLekis, get to transcend the animal soul and get to your godly soul, that's a very, very powerful feeling. It's a feeling of being subsumed because the divine soul is one with God. So is that what Buddhists are doing? I don't know. But if it sounds like what Buddhists are doing, then probably Buddhists are doing something right too. But it's that avodah, that internal work, which is really, really important. And that's the next point I want to get onto, which is the avodah. So when I was very young, one of the things which really attracted me to the study of Hasidism was this idea of avodah, of davening. People who were able to, get into a certain mindset of divine ecstasy, of transcending the physical. That was something which I always was attracted to, and it was something which I wanted to get into, wanted to experience. So what is it? From the Chabad Hasidic perspective, what is going on here? What is avodah all about? So there's this idea which Manis Friedman talks a lot about. In Slava Kadosh Baruch Hu, God had this desire, and he says it's a need. Not really a need. He caveats it out. So the need is not really a need. It's a need without a lack. The need without a lack is not really a need. That's why it's called a desire. God desired there should be a dwelling place in the lower realms. What is this dwelling place in the lower realms? What is it? I've already kind of gone over it a little bit, but let me spell it out. The lower realms is within the human being. What is the lower realms of the human being? The animal soul. The animal soul which wants animalistic things and which doesn't have the ability to perceive the divine. That animalistic soul is trying to cause the human being to go down. That an animal is, as it is explained, constantly looks down, whereas a human can look up as well. The animal soul constantly wants to look down. It wants to drag the person to more physicality, more physicality, more physicality. Doesn't allow for transcendence. Now, the concept here is that the soul came down into the body in order to fight with, in order to wrestle with the Nefesh HaBahamis, to get the Nefesh HaBahamis also on board. So the animal soul should also want to cleave to the divine, want to have to do the Vegas. And what happens when you do that? You cause there to be a dwelling place for the divine on the lower realms. What is the lower realms? In the animal soul. That's the idea. That's the whole concept. That is avodah. That is the whole work. The work is with the Nefesh HaBahamis. That's what a Beinoni is doing. A Beinoni is constantly working with his animal soul to constantly get the animal soul on side. Now, sometimes the animal soul is on side for a short period of time, then it goes back to becoming the animal soul. They need to get back. wrestle with it again, get it back on side. And every time you davening, by the way, within this idea is contemplation. It's hisponenus, it's contemplative meditation. The whole davening, if you read about what prayer is all about in Chabad Hasidic thought, it's all about contemplation. Every single step of it is contemplation. From Pesach de Zimra to Shema to Shema Esrei, it's all part and parcel of this contemplation of getting first the animalistic soul on side, and then once you get the animalistic soul on side, then you can soar high and get to Daas Elyon when you come to Shema Esrei. It's all about getting the animalistic soul on side, and then creating that dwelling place for the divine in your animalistic soul. So therefore, the animalistic soul also wants God. God feels comfortable on the lower realms. That's the whole avodah. That's the basics. And once you do that, and you get to the idea of Daas Elyon, like I mentioned, you can then have this epiphany that, wow, we're in the divine. We're in the divine essence, and we're still here. We shouldn't be here, but we're still here. But it's all about this work, this inner work. That's what it's all about. There might be extra things on top of it. That ultimately you get the ultimate, as Rabbi Yoel Kahn mentioned. But what you can end up doing is, by just focusing on the ultimate, is you can ignore all this other stuff. You can end up not doing it. You don't daven. You show up your shoulder, you talk the whole time. You don't contemplate ever. You don't do ever any spontaneous. What you do is put on tefillin with other people. I'm not trying to criticize. I'm just saying that that's what could end up happening. And then what happens? I want to get to the final part of this. And then what happens? What happens is the exact thing which Manis Friedman is criticizing. That you turn the mitzvahs, the putting on tefillin with the other people, the building the multi-million-dollar Chabad house, etc., you turn that into its own God. And you forget about the actual God. You forget about the transcendent God. You forget about the Daas Elyon. Daas Elyon is not there anymore. The a-cosmism of the divine you don't think about. It's all about doing the mitzvah. That's what ends up happening. You turn the mitzvah into the God. And you forget about the real God. That's exactly what Manis Friedman is criticizing the yeshiva world of, and that's exactly what he's doing. They say, that's what the Gemara says. There's someone who says that someone else is puzzle, a person who disqualifies others, they usually are disqualifying others in the thing that they themselves are disqualified in. Paisel b'mumei paisel. So what I'm saying here is that what can end up happening is that when you forget the transcendence and you end up focusing on the actual mitzvah itself, and that's what knowing God is, you actually turn that physical into God himself. And that's not the point. And that's what ends up happening. You don't have God. All you have is the physical mitzvah. You have putting on tefillin with another person. You have bringing people, I don't need to get into details, but the point is that realization that when I put tefillin on with somebody else is something incredibly powerful. That realization only happens after you've gone through the whole ladder and had that most profound mystical realization of the a-cosmism of the divine, yet I'm still here. I want to give credit to where credit's due to Rabbi Manis Friedman, that he is articulating one of the most profound ideas, or he attempts, I would say, to articulate one of the most profound ideas within Hasidism. And he does so using language which is shocking. And that, I think, detracts in some way from the message. He also doesn't tell the whole story because he avoids the transcendent. I understand why he avoids the transcendent in a way, because it makes God feel far away. The problem is when you don't tell the whole story, it limits God. It makes God small. So the whole story must be told, but the story is nuanced. The story is difficult. It's not exciting. Well, to some people it's exciting, but it's not as exciting because what it means is true inner work and the true ability to study him and pray and to contemplate it, to do a spontaneous. And through all of that, you might get eventually to the highest level of divine realization, the level of Moses, that true total and utter bitul self-nullification, self-abnegation, where you sense that you are totally subsumed in the divine, and then you have that realization. And if you don't tell that whole story and you avoid the certain part of it, you end up in this reductionist version of Judaism where you actually make God much smaller and you limit God just to the mitzvahs, which I would say is what Manis Friedman is doing. And the irony of it is that which he criticizes the yeshiva of doing is in fact what he's doing himself, but in a different way. Now, that's why I wanted to eventually to do this second episode, is to kind of bring it all together and to try and show, I'm not trying to, God forbid, criticize Rabbi Manis Friedman. I'm just trying to give the whole picture here because I felt that we only got part of the way there in my conversation with him. What we did do, which I think was very important, which was we got beyond some of the things which were the gimmicks. Yes, God doesn't really need, he doesn't really believe that. And yes, he also believed that God, there is a transcendent aspect of God. He just didn't want to talk about it, etc. But here I hope that I've expressed and explained this in a way which is helpful to you, the listener. One last thing, which is practical aspect of this. Okay, what's the difference? Because I go back to that story with me in camp. The practical aspect of all of this is that you could end up focusing on just being the person who wants to take care of their bunk. Just being the person who's giving the inspiration. Whereas yourself not having gone through any of that ladder of transcendence. And in that case, it ends up just being a reductionist version of Judaism without the transcendence. That's what could happen if you don't have the full picture. But because when you have the full picture, then you can actually have doing the mitzvahs with real with real ahava, love and fear, which are parkas, which actually fly above. And that is the point of the entire thing. And then you end up with this situation where you can end up actually becoming a more refined person, and your nefesh Bahamas, your animal soul, actually becomes more refined. And in that case, when your animal soul becomes more refined, what happens then? It itself wants to go up to God. You create a true dwelling place for the divine in the lowest realms within the human being. That's where it starts, and it moves out from there. That's where it needs to start. It must start there. And from there, it grows outwards. Anyway, this has been Levi Brackman with Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today. Thank you so much for joining, and until next time.